Hi, thanks for listening. I'm Diane Gould, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about behavior. It's one of my favorite subjects. But first, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about me and my background. Um, I was kind of a rare 10-year-old who wanted to become a social worker when I grew up. I think I had read a book about Jane Addams, so I wanted to, even though I didn't live in Chicago, but I wanted to grow up and go to Jane Addams School of Social Work, and I did. I started volunteering probably at 14 with our local special rec association. Um, Kind of my first introduction to being with people with special needs, and I kind of kept that interest for my whole career. I went to undergraduate at Bradley University, and I studied behavioral psych. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And then I went to graduate schools in social work and worked at different agencies specializing on disabilities and worked for a few special ed co-ops. So I've worked in 14 schools with special ed students. So I did that for decades, those two kind of careers. And then at some point, I decided I can't really have a boss anymore. And I started private practice. So I've been in private practice for a long time, first part time and now full time. And I work with families that have a child with special needs, individuals with primarily autism. I do social skills programs. And I do behavior assessments for agencies and schools and behavioral consulting. And it's been a very interesting career. So I'm going to talk about behavior today and kind of my journey in learning about behavior. As I said, was a psych major, behavioral psych major. And back in the day, a long time ago, to pass behavioral psych, you had to train a rat. Now it's all computer based, but then we had a rat lab. I had a rat named Ebony Libido. I thought that was very clever. And to pass rat lab, you have to train your rat to go from kind of the back of the box, a Skinner box, run to the front of the Skinner box, press a bar 2 times, run to the back, then to the front, press it 3 times, go to the back, then the front, press it once to pass. And you use food to teach these skills to the rat. And a lot of behavioral kind of training and research has been on rats and pigeons. Um, you know, I kind of think we're a little different than rats and pigeons, but that's where a lot of training is. What's interesting about Rat Lab, a little story, is I guess it's expensive to keep a rat lab going. So about 10 years ago, my psych department was out of money for Rat Lab. So they did a fundraiser. So if you gave $100 donation, you could have a rat named after yourself. But if you gave 500, you could have a rat named after the person of your choice. Thought it was very clever. Didn't work, but I thought it was very clever. So that was my introduction to being a behaviorist. But it's been a journey. And so after the behavioral psych degree, then I went back to kind of, social work, which is what I wanted to do as a kid, as I said. But then, working with individuals with autism and intellectual disabilities, behavior was getting in their way. And it was hurting relationships. They were having school problems, my clients, not kind of getting fired from jobs. So I thought, oh, I should know something more about behavior. So I went back to school to become a behavior analyst probably about 15 years ago. Don't really recommend going back to school, I don't know, advanced age, but I did, and I passed, and I became a behavior analyst. So I was a social worker and a behavior analyst. And, as a behavior analyst, I learned all the traditional approaches, kind of building on my rat lab. But I think it was like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Like my social work clothes fit really well, but the behavior analyst, not so much. So I tried to kind of fake it for a while, and then realized that wasn't working for me. And I've kind of come up with a newer approach, which I kind of think is more effective and much more respectful than a lot of the traditional approaches to changing behavior. I've learned some of my kind of new approach from leaders in the UK and in Sweden. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Andy McDonald and Bo Elvin. They've done amazing things. And my original training in behavior before I went back to get my BCBA to see if it could work for me again was with IABA in California, and they do great work. And I've also had training from Ross Green, which a lot of people know too. And then a couple years ago, I started, since my specialization was autism, hearing about PDA, pathological demand avoidance syndrome. Horrible name, I know, but it's a subgroup of people on the autism spectrum, and they have services in other countries, but not in America. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about PDA, and I'm part of a PDA movement in America. But what attracted me to PDA in the first place was I really liked their view of behavior and their interventions. So I'm going to kind of share those too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some traditional approaches. Kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, things that I think are good to know about behavior. And I'm going to talk about kind of what's happening in Europe and these other approaches too, and kind of my thinking about behavior. So, one of the things I think about is the ability to change behavior. It's a superpower. It's really cool. And in California at IABA program, when you go for training, they have you kind of promise you're going to use the ability for good, not evil, which I thought was pretty cool. And here's me as Wonder Woman, as a superhero for a Special Olympics event more than 40 years ago. I think it's pretty funny. But I really do like the behavior approach. Like for me, I think about behavior all the time, habits and changing my behavior. One of the first things I did with the stay-at-home order was I wrote like a goal sheet down of things I wanted to accomplish for myself, because I like behavior change. And traditional behavior change methods, they work for me. Consequences, rewards, kind of the things that we think about for behavior change, but they don't work for my really complicated clients. And that's a problem. And it also made me think about kind of the ethics of behavior change, right? So when we're part of changing someone else's behavior, I think we have to really step back and look at our goals. Are we trying to change their behavior to kind of make them more quote unquote normal, or to fit into our world? Are we trying to take away someone's autism or disability? Or what if this thing that we're trying to change is something that really makes that person happy, or in their heads makes them who they are? So I think we really have to balance, acceptance and change, because we kind of go into it, I think, too casually, the whole behavior change field. And then there's this reality that, again, I've been thinking a lot about, that children and adults have been hurt and even died because of behavior change methods. And we have to stop holding kids on the floor in the name of behavioral support. When I started interviewing for schools right out of graduate school as a school social worker, I think every therapeutic day school I interviewed at, there were kids being restrained during my interviews. And what's interesting to me too is it's called in the field often therapeutic holds, is what on paper restraints are called. And there's really nothing therapeutic about it. And Studio 3 in London, one of their goals is to eliminate, not reduce, eliminate seclusion and restraint. And in terms of seclusion, they, and I agree, feel if there are seclusion rooms, they're going to be used. So they're doing innovative stuff to eliminate that in England. Also in all the schools, agencies, programs, and even family homes I go to, the adults or the staff members usually make things worse by their behavioral interventions. That's just commonplace. Um, I go into, let's say, a school, and a child is very upset, having a meltdown. And schools often have these intervention folks. I call them the bouncers. They're hired because they're really big. Um, and they come kind of running, or sometimes I call it the cavalry, comes because you've got this kid who's having a meltdown. And of course, that escalates the child. Often the staff get too close, or they touch the person who's in crisis. And if, to me, it's kind of common sense, that's going to make things worse. But then the child will push back. And then what's on the documentation that I read as a consultant is that the child was aggressive. But why wouldn't they be, right? So in my time, learning about behavior, coming up with my, current thinking, I'm like, we need a better approach. We need a new approach, and we need to think more about this. So a little story called, kindness trumps control. I'm trying to bring back the use of the word Trump into common language. I don't know if I'll stick with it, but I'm trying. So kindergarten. So when I was 5, kindergarten age, kindergarten wasn't public. They weren't part of school. So you had to go to like a private kindergarten. And kind of near my house, we had this kindergarten on a farm that my older brother went to, and he loved it, and they loved him. So I was lucky enough I was going to go to this kindergarten on the farm. So first day kindergarten, I hated it. I don't remember the details, but I had a huge meltdown. I know I wasn't doing anything I was told to do. And it must have been so bad that the director, who lived on the farm, she kind of kicked me out and sent me to her house. And her daughter was there. In my mind, probably at the time, this daughter was like a fairy princess, but she was probably like a 13-year-old girl. And what that girl did, she gave me milk and cookies. And I remember to this day, like the relief I felt by that. And what I've thought about in my behavioral journey is, so lucky there was not like a behavior specialist as part of that program, because they're there out right now in school programs, right? Because they would have said, don't let her escape those demands, and don't reward that behavior by milk and cookies. It's the worst thing you can do. So if that had happened, I don't know what my memory of kindergarten would be. It probably would be a trauma for me. Maybe I'd feel it in my body, to the trauma of kindergarten, where I feel the relief of the kindness of this young girl. So I think we need to keep in mind kindness, compassion, over control and compliance when we think about behavior. And I'll talk a little bit more about compliance later too. So I'm just going to give you some behavior concepts, right? So we do have the power to change behavior for other people, or clients or students. It's best to partner with them, and most respectful to do it. It's also good to keep in mind people will just use the behavior that's worked for them in the past, especially if they don't have new skills to do it differently. So they're going to be doing what has worked for them. And all the reinforcement rewards in the world, they won't change somebody's behavior if the person doesn't have the skills. So when I'm doing a training live, I usually pick somebody from the audience, and I say, can you sing the Dutch national anthem? And, pretty much they say no. And then I'll say, okay, I'll give you $20. And they'll be like, no, I can't do it. And then I'm like, all right, I'll pay you $50. And they say, I can't do it. And I'll be 100, and they'll be like, I don't know it. I don't speak Dutch. And even though it's like a silly exercise, I think we do that all the time with the kids and adults, clients too. We just keep putting on rewards, and the person couldn't do it because they didn't have the ability. They didn't have the skills. And then we might say, the person's not cooperating, or they're not motivated enough, but they didn't have the skills. That's why the reward didn't work. But I think we don't pay that much attention to that too. So in a traditional kind of behavioral view, we talk about function, right? So the function of behavior is generally to avoid something or get something. We don't talk so much about that sometimes those things can be internal, can't be seen by others. But I feel it's more complicated than that. But also in the traditional way of looking at it is that kind of the challenging behaviors need to be substituted with new behaviors that make the old ones irrelevant, ineffective, or inefficient. And I think that's true, right? Because for a lot of people, but behavior can't improve unless the problem or the need is addressed. And just looking at rewards and consequences isn't usually enough, and it can make things worse, which we'll talk about when we talk about PDA. But rewards and consequences are generally not enough. Sometimes I'll go to an agency or a school and they bring out the behavior plan and it's just rewards and consequences. And that's not a plan. And they're sometimes a little shocked when I tell them that's not a behavior plan. It's also helpful to think as behavior as communication. So challenging behavior, it's a signal that tells you there's a problem. So it's not the behavior that's important, but what's important is what's causing the behavior. Russ Green says, the challenging behavior is the fever. It's just the signal. But I like that concept of it's just the fever. It's not what's making someone, ill. It's just that surface. So I want, as we, talk about this today, for you to think about behavior as communication. It's giving you information. Another concept that I think sometimes we get wrong is that success is much more motivating than failure. And success is how we learn and become more skilled. But there's this part of human behavior in our minds that say things like, well, that person has to hit rock bottom or they're going to learn from this failure. Yeah, it's really just not how it works. If anybody listening's ever been on a diet and you go to, a program like Weight Watchers, let's say, and you've been starving that week, you go for the weigh-in, and if you've lost 2 pounds, you're so motivated the next week to follow the program. But if you haven't lost weight, or worse, you've gained a pound, you're going through the drive-through on the way home, getting some fries with that, right? Because failure doesn't teach us anything. And it's a funny concept that we kind of get that wrong in our heads. Another thing we get wrong in our heads, I think, is that we don't recognize that humans are inconsistent. Human behavior is really inconsistent. When I was in my 20s, for a while, I tried to play tennis, never well, but, just some days I'd be serving and all my serves were in and I was feeling great. And then the next week, I couldn't play at all well. And if someone had come to me and said well, I guess you're not trying, that would have made me furious. I was trying equally hard both days, but behavior is inconsistent for all of us. So I love to travel in Mexico. Sometimes I can think of the words in Spanish that I want to use. Sometimes I can't. It's just how our brains work. But I'll go to schools and teachers might say, well, I know Johnny can handle math because he could yesterday. But so today he must not be trying. Well, it just doesn't really work like that. People are inconsistent. It's so much more than being bad or good. And I think we also come to thinking about behavior the wrong way because we want to think preventatively. So people always ask me what should I do if my client hits, or what should I do if my child screams? But that's kind of the wrong way. We want to kind of think of how do I keep them from screaming or hitting? Or what's the behavior telling us about the person, and what's going wrong for them right then? What need is unmet? So after the fact, what to do after, it's just not a helpful way of thinking. But it's naturally, I think, what people ask. So it's a good thing to retrain your way of looking at it. There's a behavior analyst, Robert Schramm in Germany, and he has this quote, which I like. It's not about changing the child. It's about changing the environment in a way that the child makes different choices about their behavior. But I add, if they can. And I'm in good company, because Ross Green's whole motto is children do well if they can. And I'm going to talk about his work a little bit. He focuses on lagging skills that need to be taught and problems that need to be solved collaboratively. But it's about the environment more than the child. And when we talk about changing behavior, that's going to be the focus. Good news and the bad news, right? We change the behavior of others by changing our own. And that's the same for our clients or students, but it's also the same for our spouse, significant other, our own children, our coworkers, right? That's the part we can control. And if we change our behavior, we can impact other people's behavior. So I think that truly is the good and the bad news. But I think this knowing yourself and understanding yourself, because behavior change work is challenging for us. So you have to kind of know your own triggers and how you deal with stress and what you need to be effective and supported. I also think it's really helpful to think about how behavior was addressed kind of in your family or in your life, because that impacts how you view it and how you react to it. I also think, even though I think we don't always want to accept it, I think humans are really punitive. I think that's our default. So when we're with somebody who's acting, challenging, a client or even our own children, we get those thoughts in our heads like, I'm not going to let him get away with that, or he needs to be taught a lesson. It's our default. And I think if we work in this field and we work with clients or students, we need to always kind of work to fight that default position of being punitive. And the more we take care of ourselves, the easier that is. So one of my mantras with behavior is that we really have to understand it before you try to get rid of it. And it's like an onion. You just keep peeling and peeling until you look and figure out what's underneath. And it takes a long time to work on changing behavior. It's not quick fixes, but dealing with challenging behavior also takes a long time and is challenging. And it always kind of puzzles me why people would rather kind of do what they're doing, even if it doesn't work, dealing with challenging behavior instead of taking the time to help improve it too. But maybe that's why I'm in this field. So this kind of the iceberg has been used for different things. It's prominent in a really nice book about behavior called Beyond Behaviors. That's at the end under references. So kind of the tip of the iceberg is the challenging behavior. That's what we see. And that's the only thing we see in challenging behavior. That's the only thing that shows. But the important stuff is all under the water. So a sensory integration issue, auditory processing, trauma, family stressors, and even just with my clients, an inability to kind of get that cause effect or figure out context or really how the world works. Those are all the things that get in the way of success or learning disabilities. So we have to know and understand everything under the water and stop just caring about that tip of the iceberg. All right, another story. So this is a behavior change story for me. And everybody likes their own stories. This is my favorite behavior change stories. So I have terrible vision. I wear contacts. These are my reading glasses. And about, 10 years ago, I used to have a really nice, very patient eye doctor in downtown Chicago. Every year I'd go to him in the summer and he'd say, Diane, how's your vision? And I'd be like, it's okay. I can see far, but I just can't read it all. He'd go, yeah, you need to wear reading glasses. And another year would go by, it'd be like Groundhog's Day. And he'd say, how's your vision? And I'd be like, I can see far, but I can't read. And he'd be like, yeah, you have to wear reading glasses. So 4 years, and I'm not even making this up, 4 years. And then I used to go to him on Saturday afternoons. So one time, the time I'm talking about, so I went to him a Saturday afternoon. That Sunday morning, for some reason, I was free. I had no obligations. So Sunday morning, got up, went to my favorite cafe in downtown Evanston, Unicorn Cafe, got my huge latte, got a bunch of newspapers, sat down, was all excited. And then I thought, oh man, probably said something stronger than that. I can't see, I can't read the paper. But next to Unicorn Cafe is a CVS pharmacy. I had parked in front of it, so I just saw it. And the words were still fresh in my head from the eye doctor. And I thought, oh, I bet CVS has reading glasses. So I left all my stuff, went next door. 5 minutes and probably $10 later, I'm back. I put on my new reading glasses. Voila! It was amazing. And I was so happy. And what I think I find interesting about this story is 4 things really had to come together for me to make this change, right? The newspaper was the motivation. I was there and ready. I had just heard the prompt, right? The instruction about the glasses, and that was really easy. It took me 5 minutes, it was convenient, it wasn't expensive, and all these things had to come together for me to make this change. Now I have, in every room I have reading glasses. I've never been anywhere without it once I started to. And I'm a motivated person, and it took 4 things to line up. But we kind of pretend that behavior change is easy. Michelle Garcia Winner from Social Thinking, she often says that she'll go into a school, somebody will have like 20 behavior, a 4th grader has 20 behavior change goals, but most adults can't keep 1 year's resolutions. So like, what's up with that, And it's true, we kind of pretend maybe because we want it to be easy to change behavior, but it's not. So my reading glasses example reminds me every time I see them that it's hard to change behavior. Sometimes behavior analysts, they don't really talk about how hard it is to change behavior. Not all, but some use tons of jargon that make no sense to people who aren't behavior analysts. And sometimes I think people use jargon if they don't really understand what they're talking about. And sometimes behavior analysts kind of can blame colleagues or parents if their kind of solutions don't work, but maybe they weren't so good in the first place. I think behavior change works best if it's a partnership, and everybody involved should understand really what the goals are. So there shouldn't be that terminology and jargon. Also, what's important and doesn't always work in behavior change in a traditional way is new behavior has to generalize to different environments. I don't really care what a child can do, like in my office or in anyone's office. It only counts if it's in the real world with different people. That's what real behavior change is. But a nice thing about ABA is it's about wanting to make sure that what you're doing as a professional is working. And that's a good thing, I think, for us to take away, knowing what we're doing is actually working. So the F word. So behavior analysts don't like to talk about feelings. And I think feelings and emotions are really important because sometimes behavior doesn't seem so logical because it's not really so logical, especially anxiety-driven behaviors. So I think in order to really effectively talk about behavior and change behavior, we do have to use the F word. Because really, sometimes people just lose it. It's true. All of us have, right? Because the demands of a situation exceed our ability to cope. So it's not really just that we're getting something or avoiding something. Sometimes we just lose it because we're human. It's not neat, it's not tidy. But what I think is kind of neat and tidy is our nervous system. Sometimes when I'm working with a little kid who's very anxious, I'll talk about, this wonderful, our nervous system, our brains were developed. So if a tiger's coming to eat us, we've got some stuff to keep us safe. It's our nervous system. Sometimes it misfires and we think there's danger when there's not, and that can cause problems. But I think so much of what's behind the challenging behavior of the clients I see is fight, flight, or freeze. And they're not behavior problems. So when I think about it, so for fight, I'll think of, let's say a teenage boy in a residential program who's really stressed and losing it, maybe yelling and screaming, having a hard time. And like I said before, all the staff come running and get in his space or touch him, and then he's gonna fight back. That's just a natural protective instinct. And it's just his using his fight reflex. So for flight, we have kids in school who run out of the classroom. They're called, it's called eloping usually. And, um, and people don't necessarily look at why that child had to leave the classroom. It's not a behavior problem. It's an adaptive reaction to to a stress. And freezing, I think about too. I have adults on the workplace who sometimes, if they'll make a mistake, their boss is yelling at them or giving them lots of demands, different instructions to do to remedy the mistake. They might just freeze. But the supervisor, the boss, might think they're not following directions or non-compliant because they're not doing anything. They're not compliant because they're frozen. So I think the root of a lot of the challenging behaviors that we're concerned with are just kind of these fight, flight, or freeze, these natural reactions to stress and anxiety. Um, so I've been able to spend a lot of time reading since I've been sheltering in place and thinking about behavior. And I think there's just great stuff from other disciplines that we might not necessarily find. I've included lots of books from in the references, but there's great stuff coming out of neuroscience. There's, good stuff. Of like occupational therapists have lots of great kind of information about the sensory system that's helpful. And so kind of looking beyond kind of your typical reading material and your own profession. I'm always a little confused why there's all these disability people and then there's special education people and they don't seem to interact. And kids grow up, so it's a little confusing to me. So be open to new approaches. So I'm going to talk for a minute again about that traditional approach, right? So it's behaviors having a function or a purpose. The function is legitimate. It's just the form of the behavior, right? And that's important to have in your head. It's considered to get something or avoid or escape, or that the behavior feels good and is reinforcing. I add because the situation impacts the ability to cope. Onto that list. And then there's some cool talking about other disciplines. Stephen Porges and the polyvagal perspective, also kind of the nervous system. There's great books about that too, in terms of the biological response to stress too. And that is a function of behavior. So I urge you to kind of dig deeper, to look past these simplistic explanations of function. And I realize if you're working in a team with people, sometimes that's not such an easy place to be. But I think we do need to ask a million questions. Why this? Why now? And look behind underneath those simplistic explanations. I go to schools with really, really challenging kids who have horrible trauma histories. And, they have these like really 2-page little behavior plans that are kind of cookie cutter, mostly rewards and consequences. And then I come in and I write 18-page ones that staff are probably not so happy to see. But, humans and these kids are much more complicated and they deserve something better too. Also, I think another thing that trips us up in understanding behavior is sometimes the short-term gains versus long-term benefits. I think with all of us, we like pretend that doesn't exist, but for all of us, that exists. So a little bit more with that traditional. So attention, food control, that getting, attainment. So a couple of comments on this. I think everyone says way too often, like, oh, so-and-so, they're doing it for attention. I usually think, yay, I want my clients to want attention, and everyone deserves attention. And usually in those situations, most of the time, I don't think that's what the child or the adult is trying to get. The other thing with control is that everyone needs control and deserves control. And usually if someone's seeking control, it's because there's anxiety underneath, and we need to look at that. Why do they need control? But everyone needs and deserves some control over their own life. And with people with disabilities, often they don't have enough control over their own life. Have a little comic in here. People give me comics, usually because my talks are too serious, so I put in some comics too. So the avoid escape, right? So leave me alone. They don't want to do the demands. They're trying to leave the area. Or it's called automatic reinforcement, is that the act itself is a reinforcer, so something that feels good, or it can be like a relief, like that makes you feel okay, like a ritual or compulsion. So a behavioral term, automatic reinforcement, can be a function of behavior. And then the sensory piece is really important. Sometimes people need more input and some people need less input. So we've talked a little bit about kind of what's behind the behavior. So now we're going to talk about changing it, right? And I do like to think about it as kind of being a detective. I love behavior change work because I think it's so interesting to really trying to figure out what's going on for someone and how to help them, and hopefully help improve their quality of life in terms of relationships, school, jobs, by helping them change behaviors that they think are getting in the way of their happiness. But I like to think about that detective part. Here's a cartoon I do like. After a hasty special education placement for behavior problems, school officials were embarrassed to learn that Marty really did have ants in his pants. I think that's a good cartoon too. And I like doing behavior change in a planful way. Even though sometimes shooting in the dark does work, it can cause problems, and they're usually temporary fixes. So I like kind of a really planned out approach. And this is kind of traditional, but I think it's important for people working in behavior. So you want to figure out what you're going to tackle, and often behavior plans, especially in the schools, they might kind of lump in 15 different behaviors in kind of one goal, but it's really one behavior to max because it's just too hard to do it right. Changing behavior is hard, so how could you do 15? And you can prioritize in different ways. You can do kind of the most serious behavior, the most frequent behavior. You can do the opposite, like a behavior you think is easiest to change. You can pick that. So there's different ways, or what's getting the person's way more. But you want to define it really carefully, including kind of a severity measure. But you want to define it so anyone kind of who walks in off the street would describe the behavior or count it the same way. So it should be very clear, and it shouldn't have any judgment in that definition. I also talk to schools and programs about focusing on patterns, not isolated incidents, because a lot of times I'll go in and the staff will say like, well, one time he did. I'm like, I don't really care about the one time thing. We want patterns. And not everyone knows about this precursor behavior category. So those are the behaviors that come before the serious behaviors, kind of the tells, the signs that the person might be starting to have problems. And often that's the best place to intervene before things get as serious. So we want to pay a lot of attention to those behaviors that come before. I know it's a horrible copy. It's from Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome in Children, but it's just kind of a method they have about how you can kind of prioritize the behavior. They give them kind of a numerical kind of rating too. So again, in traditional behavior analysis, you're going to look at setting events. And setting events are what sets the stage for a challenging behavior. They're not going to be what happens right before. They're going to be maybe like allergies or bad night's sleep, or if the person spends the weekend at grandma's, or things that kind of set the stage that it might be a situation with problem behavior. And then typically it's ABC, antecedent behavior consequence. There's a sheet coming up where we take data and we write notes on. But I think antecedents are tricky. And I think we don't kind of do that part right in most behavior change. There's generally not just one predictable thing that always happens that sets off behavior, because we're, again, more complicated. Often humans are a little bit more like that pop can that, gets shaken up, and it depends on when you open it. So it can be kind of a confluence of events or things coming together. Like a student might be able to handle a sub in math class, but not on a day that he oversleeps, missed the bus, and there's a English test or something like that. So often it's more than one thing. So I think we have to do a better job understanding antecedents. And then we're supposed to, as a team or as professionals, then make a hypothesis, a guess of what we think is going on with the behavior, and make this behavior plan of what we're going to do to support and change that behavior for that person. And it needs to include replacement behaviors. It is very rare that I read a behavior plan at an agency in school that has clear replacement behaviors in it. So a replacement behavior is a behavior we want them to do that serves the same function as the challenging behavior. And usually they just kind of say, generic things about, like, the kid should listen or be good or stay in their seat. Nothing that's kind of really replaces the behavior. And part is why adults don't do such a good job is they're really hard to come up with. So if we can't come up with a replacement behavior, how is this child or this person with a significant disability going to come up with that too? So replacement behaviors are important in traditional behavior change. Reinforcement or reward part, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is part. And then we're going to do a plan and then pay attention to see if it's working or not. So this is kind of a traditional kind of ABC data sheet that you use. But I'm kind of been thinking about lately, I think maybe this format's better, to really have the first thing about the environment. So it's really all the environmental conditions, who's in it, what the tasks are, again, like what's the setting, really understand that. And then instead of behavior, it really should be communication. What's the behavior telling us, the communicative intent? And then we can have what happens after. I think this is probably a better, but it's not kind of the way things are done. I could talk about Russ Green for a sec. He has this assessment. I have his website here. So he has a short assessment that he talks about, assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. These are just some examples, just difficulty, common difficulties people have, like handling transitions or focus. So getting an understanding of what that person has difficulty with, and then figuring out the problems, because generally problems are specific expectations that the person's having trouble meeting, right? So very specifically picking out those unsolved problems. Here's some examples from school and home, kind of getting out of bed in time at home, or sitting next to someone in a class or a circle time. And then the Ross Green approach is often called like the Plan B approach. It's coming up collaboratively with solutions. And there's lots of stuff on his website about that, and videos and books that are really helpful. Also, when I was kind of researching innovative behavior change methods, I ran across these folks that are big on the integration or inclusion movement, supporting adults with disabilities. And when they're working on behavior change, they don't ask any questions about behavior. They talk about quality of life, like how do we help this person, expand their relationships and have more fun and be in the community and have a sense of health and wellness and contribute to others, feel more powerful, have valued skills. And then they also talk about how to support the people who support them, making sure that those people get what they need. That was really interesting and helpful. And because here's the takeaway. People who are well supported, have power and control in their lives, fulfilling relationships, have skills that make them feel successful, meaningful, fun activities. They feel like they're contributing, they're relaxed, and they feel heard. They don't have challenging behavior, so they don't need behavior plans. So it's a different kind of way to come at the problem, and I really like that. I've been fortunate to be in contact with people in Europe working in behavior, and they're about 30 years ahead of us. Canada's ahead of us too. So in Ireland, there's this agency, and they don't, on their paperwork, talk about the challenging behavior. They just talk about the communicative intent. So instead of like having a target behavior of, running away or elopement, they would just have it, he lets us know that he wants to leave the job site, because that's what he's trying to tell us. And Studio 3 in London, which I'll talk more about, they just call them stress support plans because they think it's all about the stress that needs to be addressed too. But I think most people in the behavior world, and I agree with this, you need some data. A lot of us are not so good at data, but it does really help because we're just as humans not great at having an accurate assessment. You know, if I ask a parent or a teacher kind of how often this person might scream, they might say all the time, right? And that's not totally true. But if that person screams 50 times a day, if we write a behavior plan and it gets down to 40, it's still going to feel like all the time. So we stop doing the interventions because we think it wouldn't work. So it's good really to have some data because it is a process and you need to kind of know what's happening. So I think one of the barriers to data is often it's made too complicated. So I think we have to find simple, effective ways to take data, and that's possible. I go to schools and there's notebooks and notebooks of data sheets, but they stay in the notebook. They're not kind of used to look for patterns or kind of assess what's really going on. So taking data and not using it, that's not so helpful. It's usually, again, about changing the environment. I'm going to talk more about that. It's not really a focus on the person as much as the environment and what's happening, that big picture. And there's two really helpful questions if you're kind of working in behavior change or trying to help a person or a family. So there's two good questions to try to make it a little more predictable, because if you can understand the behavior again, right, you can help. So two good questions to ask, like if I'm going into, let's say, a day program, I might say, you know, if I want to come back next time and you want to make sure I see that challenging behavior, how would you set that up? And the staff might say, well, it would be in arts and crafts. His favorite staff wouldn't be there, so it'd be kind of one of the younger staff. And I'd have him like sitting between this guy and this guy. For sure, somebody's going to get hit. And then, of course, then the second question is, so if I wanted to come back and you wanted to make sure that I wouldn't see any problems, what would you do? And the staff are usually, you know, oh, that's easy. It would be when we're doing sports, his favorite staff would be with him, and these two girls that he just loves would be on his teammates, right? And it just helps us get a better picture, because we have to have that picture to start, you know, in this change. Often people start with the solutions without getting enough information, but it's all about the process and talking and getting information, that digging deeper. Because again, we don't want to get rid of a behavior unless we understand it, because it could cause a more problematic behavior. And in my mind, I always say, don't play whack-a-mole, because that's what we often do. We kind of get rid of one behavior, another one pops up. Get rid of it, another one pops up, because we haven't kind of looked like beneath the tip of the iceberg. Too. And also, we could be eliminating behaviors that are actually helpful for the individual. I know tons of students who need to kind of get up from their chair, walk around, maybe pace to kind of manage their anxiety. But if somebody came and said, no, you've got to always stay in your seat, that person might have a much more challenging behavior. So we have to, again, watch what we get rid of, because it might serve a purpose too. And I do like to remind people of this, newsflash: any behavior plan is a roadmap for the people who wrote it. It's for the teachers, parents, staff members, just about our interventions. It's to see if what we had planned out, see if we're being effective. Because if not, we need to change it. It's not an excuse to blame the person with special needs. And sometimes it feels that way. I'll be in a school and I'll see somebody taking data and they'll be like, he yelled 10 times today, you know. And that's not the purpose of data or a plan. It's really for us. So if it's not working, it's our failure. We're not doing it correctly. It has nothing to do with the individual whose name is on top of that plan. And I think another thing that gets in the way is professionals are too busy. We're kind of racing around. We don't have time to kind of plan and reflect. When I worked at agencies, I used to always joke like a good day is a day that I only eat one meal in my car because we're always too busy. And that gets in the way of being effective. And we have to kind of stop and look at our role in a behavioral exchange that doesn't go well and what we could do it differently. And that reflective piece is critical to the behavior change process. It's not a luxury. And Studio 3 talks a lot about that. So my three most important parts of behavior change: prevention, prevention, and prevention. But then we can prepare someone for the real world. We can teach them how to handle things and build skills, but at the right time and the right way. I've worked with a number of individuals, which surprised me at first, who couldn't tolerate the song Happy Birthday. So because of that, they couldn't like eat at restaurants because there's always Happy Birthday. And instead of, their family or schools on a field trip or agencies, instead of not being able to go to restaurants, there's ways to kind of teach someone how to handle that. And that can improve quality of life. So we want to prevent and then in a planful way teach skills. And the timing has to be right. If too much is going on, or the person's in crisis or not feeling well, or the staff don't have the time, then that's not the right time. You also don't want to kind of stick with something that's not working, but you also don't want to try things once or twice and just say, oh, didn't work. Tried that plan, didn't work, because people do that. So it's finding that balance of giving interventions enough time, but not sticking with them. For some reason in schools and agencies, behavior planning is done annually. It makes no sense. A behavior plan should be a living, breathing document. It should always be tweaked and new information added about what worked or what we've learned. In schools, IP once a year, they're put in a file and often not really thought about. And same in agencies too. So a few kind of behavior change methods out of the kind of the old and new approach, and that I think are helpful. The whole idea of pre-correction, kind of before there's, and that's also why we want to understand and have things predictable. Before a challenging behavior, that's the time to intervene, to really kind of give people the skills and the tools they need to be successful. And then we're practicing doing things successfully, or the replacement behavior. And videoing it, if that can work. Video self-modeling is a wonderful intervention. It's not used enough, but you have to make sure there's no errors in it. But we have to know what skills are weak or lacking and what the person needs to be taught. And if we can do all this and partner with the client, it goes so much better. And have also practice thinking about all different ways that person can practice what you've decided is the skill that they don't have. And then I make sure that mistakes are not part of a learned behavior change. I think we make this mistake a lot. I think of the example of, let's say, a kid who comes home. They walk in the door from school, they throw their backpack and their coat on the ground. Their mother says, or their father, hang your stuff on the hook. The child, picks up their stuff, hang it on the hook. I think if you ask them, what's the process of coming home from school with your stuff? They'd say, I walk in the door, I throw my stuff on the ground, my parent tells me to hang it up, and then I hang it up. Like, that's how they view it, the whole kind of chain. So we're not, and we're not going to change it unless we kind of can get at the beginning and then teach them how to hang it up without first dropping it on the floor. But I don't think we always recognize that and think that way. Another thing that's helpful that I don't think everyone is aware of is building momentum, that we can get individuals and encourage them and help them be successful doing something that might be hard for them if we've had them do a lot of things beforehand that are easy for them. And even in something as basic as a spelling test, so even in academics this works, if you have 5 kind of easy mastered spelling words before 5 newer, more challenging ones, the student will do better on the 5 harder ones because they have kind of got that momentum going. And we can use that in lots of other ways, to get someone to do something that they might have some resistance for, too, just from history. Backward chaining is also a useful behavioral concept. It's starting at the end of something and working backwards instead of our usual way of starting at the beginning. Sometimes, like if there's a client who kind of wants to take some kind of activity or class, but they're very nervous, people will say, well, just go at the beginning and see if you can handle it, and you can leave if you can't. But I always find it's more effective. Have them come for the last 5 minutes and end successfully. And then you can kind of work backwards in time. Also for skills, sometimes like for cooking, or something like that, instead of kind of the boring stuff at the beginning, opening the boxes, someone doesn't want to do it, have them like do the last part and then have the finished project. And then you get to eat. So how good is that too? So these are little tricks that I think aren't hard and they can do it. I also think with so many people have problems with transition, or said to have problems with transition. And part is because we talk so much about the thing they don't want to leave, and we don't talk enough about the next activity. A lot of the things I think that work for behavior change are in terms of communication, our communication, right? We want to communicate effectively. We want to be specific. We make our expectations clear, and don't offer a choice unless there is one, because we do that all the time. Like, do you want to get dressed? Well, that's not really what we meant. We also, there's a lot of people with disabilities, especially, who just say no as habit. And one of the a psychologist from Sweden, Bo, that I'm going to talk about. I call him Bo like he's my friend, but I really don't want to mispronounce his last name. I wish he was my friend. He's explained that because so many people don't kind of know what's going to happen after. They can't really anticipate that, right? So they'll say no because they don't know what's going to happen if they say yes. And that makes sense to me. So their level of acquiescence and saying yes to things is much lower. So we want to be careful and mindful of that. We also, there's lots of people who hate the word no, and they have a strong reaction. And often I think we have a choice. We can say yes. I remember, a long time ago, I was writing a behavioral lecture when I still had children at home. And I thought, I'm going to try it. So the saying yes instead of no. So my kids, like all kids, right before dinner, are like, can we have cookies or whatever kids do? And instead of saying no, I said, yes, after dinner. And they both said, okay, thanks. I'm like, well, that was easy. So thinking about opportunities, you can say yes instead of no. A huge effective behavior change thing that's so easy but not natural is we want to be clear. We want to say to the individual exactly the behavior we want to see, but we should never, ever say what we don't want to see. The words should never come out of our lips. Hitting, running, spinning, the things we don't want should never come out of our lips. And my story for that is the last school I worked at was right next to a Dunkin' Donuts. And I love coffee. And I used to, when I first started working at school, I'd stop there every morning. I love strong coffee. I do not like sweet coffee. So I'd go to Dunkin' Donuts and I'd say large coffee, cream, no sugar. Every time I said the word sugar, the person picked up the sugar and had a little drop of sugar in my coffee, which made me very unhappy. But I was writing a behavior talk and I was thinking about this. And then I went back and I said large coffee, cream only, and I never had any sugar ever again in my coffee. But I think naturally what comes out of our mouth is often the behavior we don't want to see. And if you think about it, most of the people we're supporting have processing issues, and you're telling them run or hit, then they have to kind of process that, turn it around, figure out what they're supposed to do. And you've already yelled at them again while they're processing it. And it's just so much more clear to tell them what you want. So that if you're going to pick one thing to change about your communication, do that. It's magical. It works so much better. I've been thinking about this lately. The hardest thing to do is nothing. Just sit quietly and be present with another human being. We often put so much pressure on ourselves to do something, to say something, when it makes things worse. Often people, especially people under stress, yeah, just be there. Think about it. So again, as I've been working on, my whole new behavior method, I've been thinking about this part. What comes naturally to us is usually wrong. So we try to teach lessons when it's not useful. Like if a person is really upset, we try to teach them stuff when they can't learn, when they can't process, or we do it after the fact. So, you're this is a typical family thing. You're sitting around the kitchen table and, your kid kind of spills their milk. We say something like, oh, be more careful. Really? Like, that's not helpful. Or if you're even walking with your partner, your significant other, and like you trip, they might say, oh, watch your step. Really? Like, it's not helpful, but it's just what comes to mind. And all the don'ts, like I was saying before, all the don'ts that come out of our mouth. The other thing we do is we treat behavior challenges all the time like they're knowledge deficits, but they're really not. Even if I'll go into like a preschool class and it's circle time and a little girl kind of just like slaps the girl sitting next to her, the preschool teacher says, oh honey, it's not nice to hit your friend. Now I always picture the little girl saying, oh really, I thought it was. Thank you so much for that information. Because that wasn't what was going on. That wasn't what was getting in her way. But we give all this knowledge, and it's written in behavior plans all the time to remind kids of the rules when they misbehave. But that wasn't what caused the problem, and it's kind of irritating. Just like anyone who has a family member or lives with someone or a significant other, if you're really worked up and you're upset, if they tell you to calm down, it just makes you more mad, right? That's just how it works. So what comes naturally to us is often wrong for all of us. It's just human. There's a couple quotes about swimming. I don't know why there's multiple quotes about swimming and water and behavior change, but I think they're good ones. So someone once said, you can't teach someone to swim in a few inches of water, but you can't teach them to swim in the deep end. It's finding the right level. And then there's a good psychologist. I have his website as reference, with a really good website. He's in Virginia, and he says when a person is drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. So when someone is in a major upset, a meltdown, that's not the time to kind of teach. It's when we're going to manage behavior. We're not going to try to teach lessons then, even if that's our instinct. So a couple more things in the traditional approach, reminding you of that if you're kind of want to talk about behavior. It's about changing the environment, teaching appropriate behaviors that serve the same purpose, that replacement behavior part. So interventions when someone's trying to get something, right? It's basically, you don't want them to get what they want when they're not doing the behavior you want them to be doing, and you want them to get what they're trying to seek or obtain, even if it's attention, when they're acting the way you want them to do. It's kind of this idea that life should feel much better when you're the person's doing what you want them to do than when they're misbehaving. For escape avoidance, you can make the task easier, shorter, more interesting, giving a lot of choices. And I think what's important too is reliable ways of escape. And that needs to be in many more behavior plans than it is. People need an out. They need to know how to get out of a situation. And that's an important thing to think about. The whole sensory piece, sometimes people need to increase kind of the stimulation and sometimes to decrease. So part of traditional behavior change is reinforcement. You guys have probably all heard that word, right? And like I'm saying, reinforcement is supposed to, you reinforce when the person's doing what you want them to, so they think like, oh, the world's better. And then they don't get reinforcement when they're not doing what you want them to do. And it needs to be very specific to the person. So there's preference assessments. People don't know it can't just be made up like the schedule. It needs to be related to the misbehavior if you're going to use reinforcement. Can't just be like pulled out every 10 minutes, this is going to happen, or even at the end of this period. The schedule needs to have something to do with the misbehavior. And in my mind, reinforcement only works if motivation is the problem. That the person has all the skills, just they're lacking motivation. And it's pretty rare, actually, that that happens. Deprivation helps in kind of traditional reinforcement. If someone has a ton of reinforcement, they don't need to work for yours. And it only counts if it's changing behavior. Chocolate might be a great thing, but it's not a reinforcer if it's not changing the behavior in kind of traditional part. But also, I think like systems are set up with all these artificial reinforcers where if you're going to use reinforcement, you can usually just reinforce with what the person wanted in the first place. They wanted attention, give them attention. If they wanted escape, give them escape. You don't have to like make some silly chart. And another thing though to think about with rewards and reinforcement, because I don't know if everyone does, is the lack of earning a reward can feel like a punishment. So, you know, a lot of programs really pride themselves on being so positive. They'll say we're only a positive program, but if not getting something positive feels like punishment, then it's not so positive. And one of the things I learned from kind of the PDA, the pathological demand avoidance syndrome, is for many people that just the idea of getting a reward builds anxiety. So we think we're being so kind by giving rewards to people, but it shouldn't be used on everyone. It can be counterproductive. And that's news to many well-meaning teachers, parents, and professionals. So we think it's a good thing, but sometimes it's not. And I usually like to talk a little bit about reinforcement versus bribe. So I think traditionally, you know, some people kind of lump it all in one part, but in my head, like reinforcement is more planned, it's offered before misbehavior, and a bribe is something in the middle of a meltdown or misbehavior you pull out. Some people, more traditional thinking people, think it's bad to give a reward during challenging behavior, but some people don't think it really matters. That reinforcement isn't kind of the end all be all anyhow. So it doesn't really matter. And what's most important at a time is just getting out of a situation that could be dangerous or just feel horrible for the people involved. Another behavior concept that people do know some of, it's traditional, but it's helpful, is that shaping. It's that successive approximation. So it's baby steps. It's just kind of little steps in the right direction, kind of supporting and reinforcing them. It's like baby steps. But I think you have to be careful what you reinforce. And I think this is not talked about and really important, is there's a big risk in compliance training. And I think most people that have gone through special ed or programs have been taught that being compliant is a wonderful thing, and they've had tons of rewards for kind of being compliant. And I think we put them at risk for abuse and exploitation by giving them that message. So I think we have to be very mindful of compliance training too. So situation management strategies. So again, we want to really focus on the environment for a person. I usually just say at least 80% of behavioral approaches need to be environmental. I would actually say closer to 100 if I could get away with it, but maybe I will now. So it's changing the environment. So anything you think can trigger someone or make it more likely for challenging behavior, that's what you want to think about. And that could be a demand, or it could be an object or a person. So really rearranging the environment to set somebody up for success. We don't spend enough time doing that. We more talk about rewards and punishments and less about kind of the environment. And we can also give the person something to do that they can't do if they're having challenging behavior because they're just not compatible at the same time. So I've worked with lots of people in schools who like rip things off walls or touch things that they shouldn't touch when they're in transition. But if they're kind of carrying the gym equipment with them to gym class, they're not touching other things. Like, so sometimes I think like the simple approaches make the most impact. So planned ignoring, it's pretty much in every behavior plan in a school I read. It's almost never done correctly. People are good at ignoring. They want to talk about ignoring, but ignoring is only half of an intervention. So in theory, it would be when the person is trying to get your attention, you should ignore that attention-seeking behavior, not the person. Shouldn't ignore humans. And you should pour on attention when they're not doing the challenging behavior. So it needs to be both. It only works if the motive is that the person's trying to get adult attention, which is pretty rare. And it's overused and used incorrectly all the time. It's almost in 100% of the plans I read too. Another problem in most plans or approaches, especially in schools and probably some agencies too, is after an incident, there's a processing time. And that's fine to have a processing time. But in reality, often what they look like to me is more like a shaming time. It's processing time would be really to reconnect, to repair the relationship, to make sure everyone's okay, and maybe do some problem solving. But to be trying to get like an apology or to have a kid just recite the rules, yeah, that doesn't feel helpful at all and can be hurtful. So the devil's in the details with all the behavior change stuff. Very little differences, voice tone, proximity, schedules, things in the environment make all the difference. So it's something that makes this work really hard. Another little cartoon. So punishment. So one of the problems, there's lots of problems, but one of the problems with punishment is it doesn't teach the person what to do next time they're in that situation. I remember in a school I worked at, there was, a kid who wanted, the toy this other kid had, and it became, a fight, and it escalated. And the child was punished for it. And I remember like saying to the teachers at the time, so how is this going to help him next time he wants a toy another kid has? How to work that through? Like how does this punishment help with that? So that's the problem with punishment. Timeout is used for all the wrong reasons and way too often, and it's generally not helpful. If someone needs to take a proactive break, that's a whole different story, and that's a good skill for people to have. But timeout is used wrong, and it's hurtful and unhelpful. And punishment can make just a setting aversive or relationships hurt. So if you want this child to like school or someone to like their job, punishment's going to get in the way. And you can change behavior without it. So I'm going to talk now, I had said I was going to talk a little bit about PDA and Studio 3 in UK. So PDA it's a subgroup of the autism spectrum. People with PDA avoid everyday demands, and it's based on anxiety, and they have this need to be in control. Often because of these things, they can have very challenging behavior. Most people with PDA don't make it in school. Often they're homeschooled, or they're considered school refusers, which makes no sense to me to refuse something that doesn't work for you. It just seems like a good choice. And what I was drawn to in PDA, as I said before, is they have really nice interventions. And what was an eye-opener is that reward systems are ineffective and can make things worse for people. The same as kind of predictable structure and routines that were kind of generally just pour on for people with autism, they make things worse for people with PDA. And a lot of kind of the interventions are kind of not hard to do, and they're respectful, and they're indirect, and they work really well. Just kind of using humor and kind of challenges, using the person you're trying to support's input in what you're planning. Empathy always helps, right? For every situation, just showing your understanding, giving choices, reducing pressure, really kind of allowing extra time for people, picking the battles, prioritizing, um, and then doing a lot of kind of indirect language. And this helps for lots of people, not just people with PDA. Like, you can just talk out loud about a task you need to be done, you need to have done. Like, if you're in a classroom and you're like, oh, I know I need to have the garbage taken out and erase the board, I don't know how I'm going to do both, that person might volunteer, instead of, if you ask them to take out the garbage, they might panic and have a meltdown because that demand was overwhelming. Also, praising someone directly can embarrass them and put these expectations on them that they fear they can't live up to. So you can kind of just talk about them to someone else, saying wonderful things, and let them overhear. Too, and asking people kind of, what they need, what they want, and building trust, that relationship part too, and throwing in novelty instead of routine, which is very different for a lot of us working in disabilities, and having code words and exit strategies for any situation that might be challenging. And I like this kind of visual that comes out of the PDA literature, is really kind of looking at a given moment, because people, right, are inconsistent. We change, we have throughout the day, throughout the hour, throughout, a moment sometimes. Anxiety and tolerance, and then matching that with how important this demand really is. So not just looking at one part, but looking at them in sync, I think is just like a gift from kind of the PDA literature, because this can help so many folks that we're trying to support. So Studio 3 is also in London. Andy McDonald, he developed this low arousal approach. There's also low arousal North America that right now is only in Canada, and the website is under references, but I'm hoping to bring low arousal to America. So it's in various countries, but not here. So a lot of the philosophy is that it targets our own behavior instead of the client's. So it alters like our approach, so we're not confrontational in how we interact with clients. So a lot of how it looks is just really minimizing what we say and reducing arousal in the environment, watching kind of our nonverbal cues, and then reflecting on how we're interacting. So it's very proactive. We're not kind of forcing compliance on people. We're reducing pressure and demands, lowering stress, and kind of we're low key and not domineering in our approach to people who have significantly challenging behavior. Andy McDonald says, manage the stress, not the behavior, because then the behavior just takes care of itself. And I think it's just such a beautiful mindset. So Bo Alvin in Sweden, he also uses the lower arousal approach. And he just says, there's kind of three things you need to do. You manage the behavior in a crisis as well as you can without making it worse. And then after you kind of figure out like why it happened, and then you figure out what needs to change. He said it's kind of a simple formula in theory, and it's what's done in aviation or in medicine. This is just kind of how we need to do things. And in his kind of low arousal approach, he defines challenging behavior as a behavior that causes problems for the people around the person. He talks about that. He thinks something that gets in the way of our effectiveness is that we think people have more control over their behavior than they do. I totally agree with that. And we're quick to assign motive that people are intentionally doing things, when that's not the case at all, because again, it's all that's under the tip of the iceberg, underneath the water. He also talks about emotions and affect are contagious, right? So if we're kind of angry and stressed, that's what the people around us are going to pick up. And if we can kind of demonstrate calm or happiness, that is what the people around us are going to feel. Babies do it. It's just natural, this contagion, but we don't really keep that in our head so much. He also talks about the protective factors, right, too, that if people have support, if they have fun, if they have interest, if they have friends, meaningful activities, that's going to help with behavior. And if we can lower the stress and adjust demands based on what the person can handle, then we're going to have less challenging behavior. So he and all the Studio 3 folks, they talk about if behavior is escalating, stay calm or look calm, avoid eye contact, avoid anything that kind of looks dominating, like use a calm voice, keep a distance. The opposite of what we typically do is go towards someone, to step back, don't follow. And anytime you give a demand, step back a little bit more. Even to the point if you can sit down, never kind of be face to face with someone, try to not emphasize yourself, kind of to be smaller. If you need to kind of change it up, change staff, diversions are great. Sometimes I like spill my water or something as a diversion, just to kind of break the tension. And he talks about sometimes you just have to give in to the demands. Don't like stick with what you said you're going to do if it's not working. We're pretty stubborn sometimes. And then in the chaos phase, when things are really, kind of problematic, he says often just waiting it out is really the best thing to do. Crises pass, even if you don't do anything. And generally an individual, like even if they're like throwing a chair, they're going to get tired too. And as he points out, kind of no professional's really been killed by having a chair thrown at them, but there's a lot of people who have been killed and died by being restrained. So he talks about that. Just wait, do nothing, wait it out. It's usually a very short period of time. Have other people leave the area, avoid touching the person. If you have to, just kind of, use a relaxed hand. To, if someone grabs you, relax instead of tense. To just try to stay calm. And then after kind of things, a meltdown or behavioral escalation, again, just stay calm and wait. But if there's a mess, he's really strict on the adult cleans it up. We're better at it. And the sooner we can get the situation to look back to before an episode, the better. So just do it. Clean up. Don't do that like punishy thing, like make the client have to clean up the mess they made. That's that punitive self in the back of our heads, our default. And then he talks about, have a cup of hot chocolate, just sit quietly, and you don't have to talk. Don't force people to talk when they're not ready. It doesn't work. Provide comfort. And then after, try to figure out what demands or expectations the person couldn't handle and how you're going to kind of do things differently in the future. It's our interventions that get in the way. And I love the Studio 3 approach and the low arousal. They have a ton of webinars on their website too. And now, people are paying more attention to trauma. There's a lot of talk about trauma-informed approaches, and all kind of the PDA and the Studio 3 approaches, they are very trauma-informed, right? So with trauma, we want to help people kind of stay in the here and now. So kind of stressing safety and food and drinks and calming smells, not isolating the people, which is often our habit, is kind of leaving people on their own when they really need the support and comfort of other human beings. So close is no cigar. So keep in mind, it's a process. It takes time. Think proactively, not reactively. There's no one size fits all. You can't really cut and paste approaches. And it is about doing things differently. And one of the problems with doing things differently that I see is human beings under stress. All of us sometimes get rigid. And most of the clients we work with, they're pretty rigid. So we need to combat that by being really flexible. Because I always say, like, rigid and rigid does not equal flexible. If someone's digging in their heels and we push them, they're just going to dig in their heels stronger, right? it doesn't work, but that's our instinct too. We need to kind of connect with people emotionally before we can kind of get any movement. And humans need to be regulated emotionally to listen. So we waste our breath all the time and then we're frustrated. But the person couldn't listen to us because they weren't regulated. I hear in lots of agencies and schools, they'll complain about someone argues. And sometimes I try to gently point out it takes two people to argue, really. So we need to, again, look at our own behavior. And and probably most important, remember that no technique, therapy, skill is more important than the relationship. At the end of the day, people just want to feel heard. So think about that relationship. Keep your cool. It's the hardest part of all. Um, we can't help people regulate their emotions if we're not emotionally regulated. And part of that is practicing self-care. Often people in the helping professions are the worst at self-care. So we really need to do that. This is hard work. So be kind to yourself. Thank you.